Um, Part 2, The Roots of Black Radicalism, Chapter 6, The Historical Archaeology of the Black Radical Tradition, and then Part Black Brazil and Resistance. Hey! Brazil, by the second decade of the 19th century, had amassed a population, half free, half slave, of more or less 3,817,000. It was then in the midst of the process of importing the almost 2 million Africans, whose arrival it records give evidence for between the years 1800 and 1850. In a way, all this activity with respect to the slave trade was quite in character for a society whose economy, social structure, and mores had become dominated by African labor. Brazil had become a slave society that obtained a scale of dependence unmatched by any other. Indeed, slave labor was so omnipresent in Brazil by these years that its uses far exceeded the elementary functions of material production. The presence of slaves had begun to invade the more subtle regions of vanity and vice, providing the master class with a certain pressure, with a certain pleasure of command and authority, as one mid 19th century Brazilian observer, Luiz Lacerda, put it. And this is really interesting to me. Like we will be reading Pan Africanism and the African Diaspora by Ronald Walters, and in that he talks about the different social. Okay, well, one, race is a social construct. Depending on where you're located, race will be different, i.e., South Africa, to compared to America, right? And so even within Brazil, race is constructed differently, and he does talk about it there a little bit, but I believe I have to like go back and read it, but we'll get to that. But it's really interesting to see the different constructions of the different social constructions of race and how that plays into perspective, understanding, blah 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 blah, socialization and politics, whatever. Um, but okay, yeah. Robert Conrad had made the same point more geographically. Nope, more graphically. Sometimes my brain does that, and I'm or like makes. We're not gonna get into that. We've talked about it before. A Bahian writing in 1887 revealed that before 1850, wagons or carts were almost never used in his city to carry loads. Weights were carried on the heads of slaves, or by means of the most barbaric and anti-economic instrument imaginable, the pole and line, with which 8 or 12 men were sometimes employed in carrying a single burden. Wealthy persons were transported about Brazilian cities or even through the countryside in sedan chairs, palanquins, or hammocks with a similar lavish use of personnel. Now the slave was more of an object of luxury. As La Sierda had believed, the slave in 19th century Brazil had become a costume, an item of social dress and self-presentation, as well as a source of the energy that produced the real wealth of the economy. With respect to that economy, oh, and isn't that interesting? So, like, with talking about the different constructions of slavery and like the environments, whatever, it shows how like this black radical, like, okay, no, let me go back. You know how we talk about black history and like sometimes people will only talk about black history within the confines of the American boundaries, but that's not what black history is, because black history is where black people are throughout the African diaspora. And when you think about the transatlantic slave trade, it didn't just go to America, North America. You got to think about South America. And so think, and like what this book does and the other books that we will be reading, it shows how Black history 1, but the Black radical tradition 2, and Pan-Africanism 3 are all like international one in terms of the African diaspora. Oh yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Internationalist. You know what I mean? Like think, and Black history is internationalist because Black people are all up in this bitch. You know, it's not just in America. And so when you look at things with a Pan-African lens or an international lens, you can see how these different, like, one, the Black radical tradition is connected all up in this bitch, right? but also Black culture, Black history, Black people, and what does it mean to use that Blackness? What does it mean to make Black culture political? That will be touched on in Pan-Africanism and the African diaspora when we read that together. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Anyways, um, where we at? Okay, with respect to that economy, Leslie Bethel had reconstructed its character. Sugar remained the colony's major cash crop, and large concentrations of slaves were still to be found on the sugar plantations of the Reconcavo, the fertile coastal area of Bahia. In Pernambuco, in the Baixada, wait, Fluminense. Girl, I'm trying. That's all that matters, is that I'm trying. The coastal strip of what is now the state of Rio de Janeiro. Is that how you're supposed to say it? Rio de Janeiro. And a more recent development in Sao Paulo. You know what I really want to do? I want to travel to like all these places that is mentioned in books like this and like the other books that we'll talk about, and just go and just like travel. I want to go to Carnival. I want to go to like Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Is that how you're supposed to say it? New Orleans? I want to go. I want to learn how to ride a horse. Well, I've ridden a horse before. They're kind of crazy. Not they're crazy. They're big. I want to learn how to quilt. That'd be so cool. Um, so maybe we can do videos on that in the future. But I need to redo my passport. But that'd be cool. Like going to all places, Black history, Black studies, because Black studies is life studies. It's literally, and you're right. Oh, the book that I'm referencing of Black studies, and particularly Professor Joshua Myers was referencing June Jordan in the beginning of that book. And that's a book I personally need to reread, but I'm excited for that. I apologize. Slaves also worked both the cotton plantations of Pernambuco and southwest Maranhão. Cotton represented 20% of the value of Brazil's exports in the beginning of the 19th century, and the tobacco and cacao plantations of Bahia and Alagoas. In the far south, Rio Grande de Sao Pedro and Santa Catarina, Negro slaves were employed in stock raising and cereal production and in the subsistence agriculture. There were also large numbers of slaves engaged in subsistence agriculture in Minas Gerais, where the gold and diamond mines, which had flourished during the first half of the 18th century, but which were now in decline in the 19th century, had served to attract slave labor in the area. And then think about that in connection to Africa right now. Where is the gold being mined over there? And the cobalt, and the minerals, and the blood diamonds. You see how the shit is all, not shit, but how this is all connected. And if you go back in history, you can see why it's connected to this day. And isn't that, it's like, you know, like, it's like, what? Right. In Rio de Janeiro, the vice-regal capital since 1763, in Bahia, the former capital, and indeed in every other major towns, slaves were widely employed as domestic servants. And Negros de Ganho, and then when I say domestic servants, listen, you want to know what's interesting too? How in America, like, people for a while, not generally speaking, they were like either sharecroppers or domestic workers. Like, that's where my grandparents started off when they were kids, and then they like whatever. But think about that. Like, that history is not that far away. And I was looking at my family's history tree, and I'm like, oh my God. This is crazy. But you know what I mean in terms of like, oh, I was supposed to reach out to someone about genealogy. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. I'm sorry. I need to come back to that. Okay, slaves were widely employed as domestic servants and negros de gajo, individual slaves who were hired out by their masters and paid wages, were to be found working as stevedores and porters in the docks, water and refuse carriers, and even as masons and carpenters. The church, monasteries, convents, and hospitals owned slaves. The state owned and hired slaves for the building and maintenance of public works. Even in America. Even in America. Even in America. And that's what, think about why we don't have reparations. And then connect that also to prisons and mass incarceration and prison labor. Girl, I wish I could have like a mind map of everything. Anyways, slavery, it appears, occupied most Brazilians and preoccupied all. And finally, in the concentration... No. See, that's not the word that I'm trying to find. And finally, to the consternation of few Brazilians, it seems the etiquette of domination was extended far beyond the boundaries of race and color. The existence of white slaves in Brazil was attested to in my elbow hurts because this is how I like rest on my elbow, and then this is also how I do my notes too, so that's why I'm like always cracking it because it like hurts when it's like that for too long. Was attested to in 1827 by a member of the National Chamber of Deputies. It is a taint of the blood, as Robert Walsh put it with Anglo-Saxon incredulity. Incredulity, like that one drop rule, which no length of time, no change in relationship, no alteration of color can obliterate. Conrad himself observes, if whites or near whites were sometimes kept in a state of slavery, mulattoes or blacks, sometimes slaves themselves, also owned slaves. Typically of the Caribbean and South America, however, the Africans of Brazil were what Philip Curtin unfortunately described as a naturally decreasing slave population. Natural in the sense... Wait, I'm taking my socks off. It was downstairs. No feet pics. Oh my God. Ugh. Let me move this over. Natural in such instances may be the historical demographer's way of indicating the unfavorable ratio of births to deaths in a population, but its use here is both unfortunate and unacceptable for two reasons. First, because it appears to draw our attention too narrowly to the slave as a biological organism, presuming a normal environment. Think about that. The enslaved Africans were brought from their normal environment to an abnormal society of the Western population of plantations and whatever. When something's not in its regular environment, it will not thrive. Right? But here it's when it's talking about a natural thing that happened, it's showing that the African now as the slave now as a biological organism is in a normal environment. The slave is in a normal environment according to Western standards. Dude, and then connect that to psychology, like abnormal psychology. That's a whole thing. But where was I going at? Where did I want? Anyways, we'll come back another time if I remember what I was saying. Oh, but this is saying why he's wrong, because he's like, you're assuming that the slave is in a normal environment, but girl, they have low birth rates because they're literally overworked. This and the third. These are abnormal conditions. It's a plantation. What do you mean? You know what I mean? Okay. Right. Per. And second, because such a phrase as naturally decreasing diminishes the painful reality and the tragic experience of Brazil's slave population. Bethel, on the other hand, puts this decrease in its historical context. The slave population of Brazil required regular replenishment through the transatlantic slave trade. One reason for this was the very high slave mortality rate. Many slaves never survived their initial acclimatization and training. Others died as a result of poor diet, insanitary living conditions, and disease. More important, since it was considered most economic to work out slaves and then to replace them with others, a great many Africans died from ill treatment and sheer exhaustion. At the same time, the rate of natural reproduction among slaves was extremely low. Importante. In addition, he remarks, there were, on the average, 8 men to every 2 female slaves, and infant mortality was high. The end result, as Bethel had already had seen to conclude, the slave population in Brazil required regular replenishment. The second cause for the increase of slaves in the early 19th century Brazil was the rapid growth of the region's economy during this period. In this respect, Brazil was responding to political, economic, and financial forces in the world market. At its base, the spurt in the Brazilian economy was a consequence of the market demand for sugar and cotton. The American Revolutionary Wars, the French Revolutionary Wars, and Napoleonic Wars, and, not least, the bloody uprising in the Caribbean sugar islands of Saint Domingue had crippled many of Brazil's economic rivals and raised world prices for tropical produce. There's a connection right there to something. War economy, I'm thinking about. Inflation, I'm thinking about. Stocks and recessions, I'm thinking about. But I can't make the connections right now. So we'll keep going, but that's interesting. We'll come back. Period. These highlights are in green. Parallel interests in the early part of the century also encouraged the extension of coffee cultivation in Brazil. Planted in Maranhão in the Brazilian north during the first half of the 18th century, coffee was brought to Rio de Janeiro in the 1770s, and in the years immediately following the establishment of the Portuguese royal government in Rio, which was in 1808, coffee became the most important crop of the nearby mountainous hinterland. Brazil was now this hemisphere's single most important site for slave production outside North America. The world economy was settling once again. How many more pages of this? Oh, okay, we're almost done. Of course, it was new sources of capital invested directly and indirectly in Brazil's trade and production that lay behind the massive slave imports of this period. And it was primarily an English merchant class, with support from Portuguese trade, American shipping, and other interests, anxious to dominate or monopolize a world market whose tropical commodities had been expropriated from their French competitors by the Haitian Revolution, which subsidized both the efforts at political independence for Brazil from Portugal and the accelerating Africanization of Brazil's economy. Eric Williams reported, "It was said that 7/10 of the goods used by Brazil for slave purchases were British manufacturers, and it was whispered that the British were reluctant to destroy the barracoons on the coast because they would thereby destroy British calicos." In 1845, Peel refused to deny the fact that British subjects were engaged in the slave trade. Notwithstanding the British government's persistent and public opposition to slavery and its efforts to compel Brazil to abolish the trade, to all of which historians have paid great attention. William observed, the British capitalists, however, remained unimpressed. By 1850, the 30th of January, an editorial in the London Times declared, "We know that for all mercantile purposes, England is one of the states, and that in effect we are partners with the Southern planter." Hold up. We know that for all mercantile purposes, England is one of the states. Oh, states capitalized. And that, in effect, we are partners with the Southern planters. We hold a bill of sale over his goods and chattel, his live and dead stock, and take a lion's share in the profits of slavery. We are clothing not only ourselves, but all the world besides, with the very cotton picked and cleaned by Uncle Tom and his fellow sufferers. Ugh. This is by a British capitalist. Okay. It is our trade. British capitalism had destroyed. It is our trade. That's important too. They literally admitted to it. British capitalists. That's crazy though. British capitalism had destroyed West Indian slavery, but it continued to thrive on Brazilian, Cuban, and American slavery. Interesting. It was for this reason, Alan Manchester reports, the suppression of the Brazilian trade was unpopular in northern England, and that John Bright called attention to the 4 or 5 million of capital and 3 million of export to Brazil, and demonstrated the damage done to Brazilian interests by the slave trade controversies. And it was this relationship that was the basis of the charge of hypocrisy leveled at Britain by certain Yankee and Brazilian critics. Such, then, were the grounds for the scale of African importation into Brazil that occurred in the first half of the 19th century. In social terms, it meant, if we follow Ramos's calculations, 2/3, 2,414,000 of the Brazilian population would become black, preto, Preto, or mulatto, pardo in parentheses, and 1,930,000 of them, slaves. Inevitably, the response to this vastly augmented slave population by the early 19th century Brazilian planters and settlers had achieved an appropriate sociology of slave control. Sociology. And though it appeared to develop in almost total ignorance of the country's maroon history of the 17th and 18th centuries, and of the political exigencies that molded the particularities of the slave trade to the world economy, that is, the varying accesses of reservoir of African labor at some level, we must presume it took them into account, if only in a mystified fashion. Kent, describing this new and presumably comforting mythology of slave control, reconstructed it as succinctly as possible. This is Kent's words in the next part. For a long time, the Portuguese morador or settler in Brazil had been. And that's why. Think about in Brazil, people talking Portuguese. Okay, let me just. You know that. Let me just shut up. Or settler in Brazil had himself assumed that all slaves from Africa were Angolas or Bantus, and since Brazilian agriculture was developed by the Bantu farmer, his reputation continued to hold even long after it became apparent that all Africans were not alike. For the Angolas sought the Engenhos sugar mill and plantation complexes in the immediate hinterland of Bahia and Recôncavo. A composite belief of their docility and willingness to assimilate in their greater mechanical inclination was grafted into the earlier reputation for agricultural excellence. The Minas, on the other hand, encountered an entirely different demand. Regarded as more enterprising and intelligent than Angolas, and as poor plantation hands at the same time, they were valued as household slaves and in the trade and skills. That's interesting. Because I feel like that's how race and the socialization and like the different conceptualizations of race play into, you know, how when the discussions about diaspora wars, blah 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 blah, and then like the conceptualization of South Africa and race, and how like Tyler's colored and this, that, and the third, like you can see those like similarities or parallels in terms of how when white supremacy ing is white supremacy ing it blah 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 blah. We don't need to have a whole discussion about that. Okay. In other words, those peoples who had in the most early era of the colony's development on a plantation and mining economy served as a source of labor were seen as pliable and naturally agrarian. Those whose recruitment coincided with the region's beginning of urbanization and secondary manufacturing were also naturally inclined to those niches as they were disposed. And, as we have already suggested, the collective myth denied the possibility of African resistance to slavery through its reliance on manageable characteristics, docility, and enterprising. This was made possible perhaps by the fact that the basic form of slave resistance up to this moment had been quilombos, a habit that physically removed the uprooted, I believe, Africans from the societies of whites. But through the legend is still maintained in some circles of Brazilian intelligentsia. In the first third of the 19th century, it was shattered. By the mid-19th century, João Pinda Calogueres commented, "The Negroes came to be regarded as a dangerous element in the population, a menace to the lives and safety of their masters." Rolly Popino concurs, noting the sharp rise in the number of slaves raised the specter of Negro rebellions, and moreover, the steady increase in the Negro sector of the population was seen to be undermining the basically European culture of Brazil. And then think about why the miseducation of Negroes is required, because when you can control someone's mind, their thinking, you can control their behavior. I didn't say it. I'm just repeating what I learned. Though the details of the history events though the details of the historical events that account for this change of attitude were still not entirely agreed upon or mastered, the broader character of those events is known. They were, as suggested, the rebellions of the 1808 through 35 period. By the 1820s, I feel like I'm saying that wrong. Bahian and other Brazilian factors had become the dominant agents in the newly independent nation's slave trade. Now, with direct control of the slave market in the hands of the collaborators close to the planters, it would be expected that the dispossession of Africans would more faithfully adhere to the rules implied by the society's code of slave control. Minas to the urban areas, Angolas to the mills and their associated plantations. For the most part, and for some time, that is how it went. Inevitably, however, new exigencies compelled adaptation. This break, one historian surmises, was important both on the construction of the slave rebellions that followed as well as their subsequent reconstruction. Kent argues that in West Africa, the breakdown of the old Oyo empire of the Yorubas and the long succession of Yoruba wars that followed in the early 19th century gave Bahia ready access to Yoruba craftsmen, and Kent reasons that this may have been the cause for a greater number of Husa slaves going to the engenhos of the Recôncavos. Two consequences, Kent believes, is the more complex slave demography that resulted were the first contemporary local authorities and subsequently such scholars as Nina Rodriguez and Ramos had difficulty reconstructing the character that would be ascribed to the particular slave moments that emerged during the period. Lord. The slave revolts between 1808 and 1835, Kent maintains, were a construct of part fact and then part attempted manipulation by local planters and merchants of state authorities, and part prejudicial renderings of evidence of Muslim involvement. Oh, and that you think about how that goes back to like the Islamophobic rhetoric from the previous chapter. Was it like chapter 4 or 5 that we were talking about that? But yeah, okay. Husa slaves, no doubt, quite active. Oh, Husa slaves were no doubt quite active in insurrectionists. Jose Rodriguez has written quite recently, the least submissive Negroes in Brazil were the Husas. They headed all uprisings in Bahia and in Brazil, being especially prominent in those of 1720, 1806, 1809, 1813, 1814, 1822, 1826, 1835, and 1838. In Reconcavo, for instance, where Husas had been sent to augment the slave labor of the Engenhos, quilombos were growing at an alarming rate all over the province by the turn of the 19th century. The fugitive slaves, moreover, were no longer avoiding even the towns, sometimes hiding within them and other times descending to loot them. Husas were also implicated in the urban revolts of September 1808 and January 1809 that occurred in the Jaguaribe Township and Bahia, respectively. A plantation revolt in the Bahian suburb of Itapano, which broke out in late February 1814, had involved Husa slaves. In December of 1826, though, it was Yoruba, and then in parentheses, Nagos refugees who abandoned Bahia to establish a quilombo in Yoruba. U-R-U-B-O. I mean, U. U-R-U-B-U. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I tried in my head first. Ramos writes, the leading figure in this conflict was a black woman, Zeferina, Zeferina, who was ultimately subdued and her arms taken from her. The confession of some of those captured made it clear that the Negroes had planned a much more elaborate uprising, repercussions of which were to be felt in the future. Again, it was Yoruba who were the basis of the urban revolt that broke out in Bahia in April 1830. A number of Yorubas broke into the hardware stores from which they took arms and ammunition, proceeded then to the arming of some 100 more Negroes, and with the considerable band attacked the police station of Soledad in one of the city suburbs. Taken completely by surprise, the authorities were helpless. Before aid could be secured, and then think about that, and then the hyper-militarization of the police. I didn't say it. Taken completely by surprise, the authorities were helpless. Before aid could be secured and a force organized, the Negroes wrought destruction in the city. The insurrectionists were finally put down with a large loss of life, some 50 perishing and as many more taken prisoners. The rest fled into the fastness of the wilderness. However, the Great Revolt of 1835 in Bahia, Ramos continued, was primarily a Husa revolt and consequently Islamic in inspiration. Their aggressiveness was was a direct social heritage from the century-old wars of religion which had assured the spread of Islam in Africa. The predominant cause, let it be repeated, was religious. Kent argues, and that's Ramos's argument. Kent argues, in contrast to Ramos and Nina Rodriguez, Rodriguez, Rodriguez. I don't think it's Rodriguez, girl, and that I feel bad if I'm really pronouncing that really wrong. I actually do. That this revolt involved Hausa and Yoruba primarily, but was led by Islamic leaders, the males. Neither this revolt nor those that preceded it were holy wars. Quiera Santos. There was no doubt that nearly all of the insurgents knew how to read and write an unknown script, probably Arabic, and used among the Husas, who appear to have now united with the Nagos. A total of 234 reached the trial stage, but under the conditions of arrest, it was not really possible to ascertain how many of these had been actually involved. Nonetheless, the Nagos, Husas, Nup, in parentheses, Topas, Geges, and Bornus, in parentheses, Kankuri, accounted for 213 alone. The total included 14 women. Ramos and Nina Rodriguez, Kent suggested, erred on relying too much on the trial records. Because, the trial records are more likely to conform to, European white supremacist notions rather than, right. And that's probably why they're saying they are, it's like Islam, because they already had the anti-Islamic rhetoric, xenophobia. Right. You see those connections right there too. That's what I'm thinking that he's saying. Yeah, listen. Okay, Kent suggests erred on relying too much on the trial records of the defeated slaves and the personal papers and reports of Bahia police. Sorry. Goncalves Martins. The Bahia police chief, Goncalves Martins. Both sources were biased in the presumption that every Muslim was a rebel and every rebel a Muslim. See, I'm a girl. And then think about, The male-led revolt of 1835, Kent concludes, will be understood in all of its aspects only through the most minute study of data relating to an intra-African relations within Bahia itself. Irrespective of the scholars' debate, it is quite clear that the revolts were grounded in on the synchronicities of African culture and ideological materials. Ramos, Nina Rodriguez, and Kent mention the Yoruba secret society. Obgoni, Obgoni, as a source of the group's militancies, and everyone seems to agree that Islam played a tactical and strategic role in those movements for which the Hausa were directly responsible. In the 1835 rebellion particularly, the warning issued by the Count of Arcos, one-time governor of Bahia from 1810 to 18, appears to have fully realized. The mightiest guarantee for the security of large Brazilian towns in the incompatibility of various African nations, for if they ever overlook the enmity which naturally disunites them, those of Agomez will become brothers of the Nagos, the Greges, and the Asuas, the Tapas with disunites them. Those of Agomez will become brothers with the Nagos, the Geges with the Asuas, the Tapas with Sentias. I don't know, girl. I don't know. Nagos, Nagos, the Geges, Geges, with the Asuas, Aussas, the Tapas, Tapas, with, I don't know this one, Sentys. Girl, I'm stressed with all these names. And in this way, the great and inevitable peril will darken and devastate Brazil, and there will be no doubt that misfortune can bring about the brotherhood of the unfortunate. And there is no doubt that misfortune can bring about the brotherhood of the unfortunate. Okay. As it happened, the misfortune was the Industrial Revolution and the further development of the capitalistic world system, together in their need for primitive accumulation, translated into slavery on a massive scale. I'm putting emphasis on these words for a reason. For a reason. Explanation point, explanation, whatever. In Bahia in 1835, the inevitable result was the brotherhood of the unfortunate. Coolio. Okay. Bye, y'all. Thanks for listening.